Please join me in welcoming Taylor Bledsoe.
As the last piano keys were pressed and the instrument faded into silence, the audience reflected upon the music. They had listened to 3 different pieces so far, 1 original Bach composition and 2 imitations. Their task now was to decipher the identities of the composers. They had 3 choices: Bach, University of Oregon professor Steve Larson, and Emmy, or as David Cope's machine is more formally known, Experiments in Musical Intelligence. To the shock of Larson, when the votes were tallied, the audience named Emmy as the original Bach, Bach's as the imitation, and Larson's as the machines. The results of this musical Turing test unnerved many. It seemed to confirm an existential dread lurking in the back of the observers of AI. If code could conquer creativity, perhaps there was nothing that fundamentally separated us from machines. But perhaps, surely Rembrandt could not just be the particles of his paints, Bach the numbering of his notes, Shakespeare simply the sequence of his syllables. Yet the results were in. These machines had played the hearts of their listeners like piano keys. However, though the future of AI has been a cause of worry for some, these innovations are a surprising gift because they emphasize what makes humanity unique. The development of artificial intelligence software does not undermine, but rather underscores the exceptionality of humans, and in turn, challenges the materialistic assumptions of its creators. AI has reinforced the exceptionality of humanity by forcing us to reconsider why we create. The limitations of AI reveal that we cannot be simplified to only chemical patterns because our understanding of concepts, our desire for beauty, and our drive to create art point to a world transcending metrics and material. Now, the history of human exceptionalism can be divided into 2 philosophical groups: those who believe the distinctions between man and his environment are that of kind, and those who believe it is only by degree. The Enlightenment sought to explain all reality in terms of only particles and materials. The rise of Newtonian physics raised a natural question. If the behavior of atoms was determined by clear laws of cause and effect, were we, who are composed of atoms, naturally subject to similar deterministic laws? Materialists then, adopting Darwin's theory of natural selection, developed a purely secular origin story. According to evolutionary naturalism, all human abilities, whether cognitive or emotional, reduced to algorithms playing out through behavioral and biochemical patterns evolved for survival. To Darwin and modern materialists, man's so-called exceptionalism is simply a self-aggrandizing myth that humanity tells itself. Now, in order to properly make the comparison between man and machine, we must first define AI. Artificial intelligence, according to Princeton computer scientist Arvind Narayanan and Sayash Kapoor, is, quote, an umbrella term for a set of loosely related technologies, end quote. Technologies that create text, images, videos, and music fall into the category of generative AI. Now, these softwares can be broken up into 2 main categories that can loosely be referred to as top-down and bottom-up systems. The key difference in top-down systems is the rules are directly programmed in by a human coder in an if X, do Y format. In bottom-up systems, a model is given a large selection of pre-labeled data and told to find the patterns in it to achieve a specified goal. The model adjusts its predictive variables through complex mathematics to find a statistical pattern across the data. A model is essentially creating its own decision tree and going through the steps to predict and select the most probable answer. In computer science terms, the decision tree is called a neural network, with each of these little steps denoting a layer. What makes these systems so powerful is their ability to readjust their predictive variables and refine their future decisions. Now, the field of AI was sparked by a simple yet very potent question. If the human brain is simply a biological computer, can another computer be built to replicate and perhaps surpass its abilities? By defining intelligence as problem-solving, AI pioneer Alan Turing allowed it to be simplified to an executable task. If a machine could accomplish the task, the process it took to complete the goal would be irrelevant, even if the task was completing a work of art. However, the existential fear that machines will undermine man is rooted in the belief that we are simply biological computers. Others disagree, arguing that boiling the mental faculties down to neurochemical patterns destroys the epistemological credibility of the mind, and thus undercuts the very ability that created the materialists' worldview. By attempting to artificially replicate these capabilities in silicon, the development of artificial intelligence allows us to test if mental and emotional abilities really reduce down to biochemical algorithms pragmatically evolved for survival. If artificial intelligence programs fail to transcend imitation of human faculties, then these faculties must transcend material explanations. In this speech, I will argue the simplification of all knowledge to connections between neurons and all behavior to problem solving will constrain machines from ascending beyond imitation, ultimately leaving them incapable of understanding concepts, feeling emotions, and of course, being creative. We cannot be simplified to only patterns, as our search for beauty and our drive to create art point to a world transcending metrics and material. The mechanical view of man supposes that all mental abilities can be reduced to relationships between neurons. Therefore, understanding can be simplified to statistical relationships between terms. But let's test this theory with a story. Before her education with Miss Sullivan began, Helen Keller was confined to a world without language. Keller, who became blind and deaf as an infant, recounts how Miss Sullivan diligently taught her language through signing in her palm. Her teacher would hand her an object like a doll and proceed to sign the letters into her hand. However, as Keller recalls, in the beginning, she did not realize that these sequences actually represented words. She was simply making her fingers go in, quote, monkey-like imitation. What she called her soul's sudden awakening occurred while filling up a mug with water. While her hand was beneath the water, Miss Sullivan signed W-A-T-E-R. Suddenly, understanding flashed into Keller's mind. She realized with a start, Miss Sullivan's sign represented the water she was touching. With what she called the key to all language, Keller's vocabulary expanded rapidly. Keller's recollections reveal how humans comprehend. According to Walker Percy, Keller forms a triadic relationship between herself, the sign of water, and the experience of water. This relationship allows Keller to understand water as a concept that she can contemplate and imagine. Unlike people, machines and animals only understand language as signals or cues for other actions. As Percy points out, if you say to a dog the word ball, the dog gets excited because it only understands ball as a signal for fetch. Likewise, to the machine, the emphasis is on the pattern of the letters, not their meanings, because it statistically predicts the next few letters, not the meaning of the sentence at all. Again, we must remember that the emphasis of these models is mathematical. The mathematics is not inherent to the understanding of the language. It's only a little model that allows you to skim across the surface of true understanding. This is what Owen Barfield calls operational knowledge, or knowledge that allows someone to use something without fully understanding it. Both the trained parrot and the chatbot are simply extensions of their trainers' vocabularies. Because chatbots pick up on the patterns of the language, not on the actual meanings of the words, they make obvious conceptual mistakes. In one viral example, an image generator responded to the prompt, "Jesus flipping over the tables in the temple," with a picture of Jesus doing a backflip over the tables in the temple, rather than overturning them like in the biblical story. You see, understanding is when one conceptually comprehends. Chatbots and machines only mimic or imitate understanding. The mechanical view of man also reduces human desires to biochemical algorithms evolved for survival. However, we are often driven by desires that transcend the material benefits of our actions. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than through our seemingly irrational desire for beauty. Oftentimes, beauty is at odds with utility and efficiency, which if man was a fundamentally problem-solving being, would be our central concern. Yet many, like Dostoevsky's Underground Man, if given a choice between a mansion and a chicken coop as cover from the rain, would choose the mansion. The chicken coop is equal to the mansion, quote, if one were to live only so as to not get wet, end quote. But as the Underground Man attests, quote, what's to be done if I've taken it into my head that one does not live only for that, and that if one is to live, it had better be in a mansion, end quote. So you see, the materially useful simply does not satisfy all of our wants. If it is true that there is nothing more than material, such simple terms as amazing have no meaning. As social critic Curtis White highlights, calling the Eagle Nebula beautiful is completely irrational. It's a nebula. What more is there to say? When human beings are boiled down to particles and their actions to chemicals, there seems no pragmatic benefit for admiring beauty. Because materialists failed to grasp how people understand concepts and why they desire beauty, they're perplexed by our impulse for art. Machines can create by noticing artistic patterns, but they overlook the meaning behind their creations. And yet, creativity isn't only a mental act. Though artists often employ patterns in their work, as Marcus du Sautoy notes in music composition, creating, quote, is a fusion of rules and patterns and algorithms and something else, end quote. He asserts artistic creation is fundamentally tied to free will. Art is not a problem-solving activity because the desire to express oneself is not a problem to solve. Just as chatbots are only extensions of human understanding, machines are simply extensions of their designer's creative impulse. Without people, computers do not create. However, there is no pragmatic reason that our expressions of will should be beautiful, especially if beauty comes at a cost of utility and efficiency. Artist Makoto Fujimura argues that if people answer the question, quote, to what purpose are we making, with, we make to be useful, then we will only value what is most efficient, what is practical and industrial, end quote. In a world filled with disease, destruction, and death, there seems no utilitarian purpose to set aside the task of survival to create beautiful monuments. And yet, it is often directly because of this chaos that artists create. Fujimura posits that both the secular and religious artist create out of a belief in abundance and hope, despite their current circumstances. Art is an expression of will, but also an expression of longing for the something more. Creating is a fusion of conceptual patterns with a deep longing that if one calls into the chaos of a dark universe, something or someone might answer him. However, critics may assert that my argument prematurely dismisses the future capabilities of AI. Given technical advances in electrical components, data storage, and processing efficiency, engineers could create models whose goal is to train more advanced algorithms. Rather than philosophizing about today's AI, which is in its relative infancy, we should consider the ultimate Turing machine. A futuristic robot that can perform all actions to a high enough level that it can be mistaken for a human. Building off the Turing test, they may question our assertion that machines are merely imitating people, contending that a machine which appears to imitate all the same actions as a person is actually performing those actions. When does imitation cross into legitimate action? This imagined machine, when questioned about a topic, appears to grasp it conceptually. When interviewed about its inspirations behind its art, it reasonably describes its emotional motivations. Again, how does one know that this machine has not crossed beyond mere imitation? Now, this argument is correct to claim that many of the specific examples of AI failings in this speech will be overcome with advances in theory and technology. From today's standpoint, image recognition, text and code generation, video creation, and reasoning models will continue to improve. However, to assert improvements in pattern recognition will evolve into consciousness or some level of free will is a categorical error. Philosopher John Searle clarifies this qualitative distinction in his Chinese room thought experiment. Searle tells his audience to imagine an English-speaking person sitting in a room that occasionally has slips of Chinese passed into it. Within this room resides a rule book written in English that matches strings of Chinese symbols to other Chinese symbols. When a piece of paper is passed into this room, the person inside repeats those matched symbols. Now, to the outside observer, the machine appears to understand Chinese. But within the machine, we know that they are simply matching patterns. The brain of the algorithm, the English speaker, has no conceptual understanding of Chinese. Because of this, improvements in pattern recognition will never rise beyond mere imitation. It will only be increasing on the limit to infinity. Now, the worldview that defines us as merely chemicals divorces us from meaning. To the materialist, the longing for meaning is only a wishful dream we cling to cope with the chaos that often surrounds us. Artificial intelligence seemed to confirm this. If machines could imitate our soulful creations, perhaps our longings were just as artificial. But as we have explored, machines can and will never understand as we understand, feel as we feel, or create as we create. Once we awaken from our dogmatic slumber of materialism, we are allowed to wonder if the meaning we ascribed to our tears was more than myth. Materialism can't account for our desire to use the scars and shards of our lives as instruments to fill broken places with beauty. Art is often shaped by tears. As painter Edvard Munch reflected, quote, "What is art? Art grows out of grief and joy, but mainly grief. It is born of people's lives. Despite the death and darkness that often fill our lives, we are not playing into silence. Only now, since we have been forced to remember the reason we created the music, do we recall the reason the piano keys resonated with our hearts. The notes echo a long-forgotten hymn of hope. The world in constant change maintains a melody, and we are playing in harmony." Thank you.